Now might be the perfect time to invest in your education. If you have work experience and would like to return to study part-time for a diploma or degree in business, consider joining UCD Quinn School. Our flexible program means you can continue working whilst undergoing your studies. Find out more at ucd.ie/Quinn and search part-time courses. UCD Lachlan Quinn School of Business, developing impactful business leaders.
Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? Welcome to the AFC West Offseason Recap 2020 Season Preview. I'm Matt McPeak. This is the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we will go through the four teams in the AFC West. It's the last division of the AFC that we haven't done yet. And then starting next week, we'll hit the four NFC divisions. And by that time, we'll be getting into draft previews and whatnot. So let's start off this episode with the defending Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. They won the AFC West last year, 12-4 record. They were 6-0 in their division. The Chiefs hosted the Texans in the divisional round after earning a first-round bye. The Texans jumped out to a 24-point lead in that game with a 54-yard pass from Deshaun Watson to Kenny Stills on the opening drive. The Chiefs followed with a 3-and-out, capped off with a blocked punt for a Texans touchdown. Then the Texans scored again with a 4-yard touchdown pass from Watson to Darren Fells after Tyreek Hill muffed a fumble. Or it was a punt return, I think, at the Kansas City 6-yard line. So things were not looking good for the Chiefs, but Patrick Mahomes reminded us all that he is the man. The Chiefs responded with 6 unanswered touchdowns, 4 straight touchdown passes from Mahomes to Damian Williams and Travis Kelce, followed by 2 more rushing touchdowns by Damian Williams. He had a huge game in that divisional round. Then in the AFC Championship, Mahomes had over 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. He also ran for 53 yards. And had a 27-yard rushing touchdown. The defense showed up big in that conference title game, though. They held Derrick Henry to only 61 yards total. They also kept Rookie of the Year snub A.J. Brown to only 3 catches for 51 yards. In fact, tight end Anthony Ferkser and offensive tackle Dennis Kelly were the only guys to score for the Titans. And then in the Super Bowl, the Chiefs had the 49ers. They held the 49ers to 10 rushing yards per game less than they averaged throughout the year. So that was good. Raheem Mostert was he was the only 49ers to rush for a touchdown, which says a lot considering how dominating that 49ers run game was last year. The Chiefs only scored 10 first-half points and were down 10 points going into the fourth quarter. The Chiefs' first possession in the fourth quarter ended with a Mahomes interception on the San Francisco 13-yard line. So things, again, were looking pretty bleak, just like they did in the divisional round, but Mahomes put the team on his back. He threw 2 fourth-quarter touchdowns in that Super Bowl. Damian Williams put the cherry on top of the 38-yard rushing touchdown with less than 2 minutes remaining. It was an awesome game. As usual with defending Super Bowl champions, the Chiefs had a handful of their top players leave in free agency. Their best cornerback, Kendall Fuller, he signed with the Redskins. And their second best pass rusher, Emmanuel Ogbah, left for Miami. Not too bad, really. They re-signed Demarcus Robinson to keep the wide receiving core intact. And they re-signed Bashaud Breeland, although he'll have at least a 4-game suspension who knows how many games after violating the substance abuse policy and then getting arrested on marijuana possession and resisting arrest. So he's going to have some issues to deal with. The Chiefs also signed running back DeAndre Washington from the Raiders. There was a bunch of players that switched teams from one AFC West team to another. They brought in tight end Ricky Seals-Jones, defensive end Taco Charlton, but the Chiefs' draft class is really the story of this team's offseason. With the offense pretty much completely intact from 2019, the Chiefs used their first-round pick on the all-purpose running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire from LSU. Andy Reid loved this guy so much. He said he could be even better than Brian Westbrook, who is one of the best running backs in the league every year with Andy Reid. He's going to be a nightmare in the screen game with defenses forced to play so deep because of the combination of speed and deep ball accuracy that the Chiefs have. There will be very few, if any, linebackers that will be able to cover Edwards-Helaire in the open field on those Texas routes or those flat routes to the sticks. But he's much more than just a scat back. He can run between the tackles with power and with vision and all those traits that you still need to be an effective runner. As with almost all rookie running backs, pass protection needs to be on his priority list. As we see every year with these rookies that come out, pretty much their ability to pass block dictates how much they get on the field. However, I don't really think it's going to be as big of an issue for Clyde. Kansas City's running backs only blocked on 12% of their snaps, which was the fifth lowest in the league in 2019. Clyde's problem will simply just be getting enough time on the field. The Chiefs have a stable of guys that they like. Damian Williams led the team in total touches last year, despite only playing in 11 games. He will probably still see the majority of the running back work, at least for the first half of the season. Then you got Darrell Williams, who last year was their third running back. He had over 150 touches. He was a good fill-in number 2 running back for the weeks that LaShawn McCoy was hurt, which there was a bunch of them. Both of the Williams runners and newly signed DeAndre Washington will all be free agents in 2021. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at Clyde Edwards-Helaire in your dynasty leagues, is that come next year, he's going to be the top dog there. Then there's Darwin Thompson, rookie from last year, that didn't really get all that many opportunities, but in the 3 games that he had 8 or more touches, he averaged over 4 yards per touch. He scored his only touchdown in the game that he saw his season high in touches, so he's proved that he's a reliable backup and that you give him an opportunity to play and give him enough touches, he'll make something happen. With only 7 picks to make in the 2020 draft, the Chiefs spent 4 of them on defensive players. Linebacker Willie Gay from Mississippi State will hopefully replace Reggie Ragland in the middle of the defense. Defensive back L'Jarius Sneed, who played corner in his first 3 years at Louisiana Tech. Then he stepped up and played safety in his senior year, and what do you know, he led the team in tackles. So he made that transition pretty well. He's returned 3 of 8 interceptions for touchdowns, which is the most pick sixes over the 4 years that he's played. He's going to be a super versatile player for them, and he should complement Tyrann Mathieu really well. Then they get a defensive end from Michigan, Michael Dana. He doesn't really fit that type of Steve Spagnuolo defense with his shorter frame, doesn't really have the longest arms, but the coaches must have something that they like in him. Hold on there. Excuse me. But yeah, the coaches must have seen something they like in him for them to draft him when he doesn't really fit that prototype of what Spagnuolo is looking for in his defensive ends. Then you got in the 7th round, Bo Pete Keys, 6'1" corner from Tulane. At the combine, he was the number 11 cornerback in the broad jump and the vertical. He's got great man coverage skills, but apparently he's a bit too aggressive, which is why he fell in the draft. So if he can develop into a starter, if he can kind of play, a little more conservative, the Chiefs will have hit on an absolute steal in the 7th round because from everything I read, this dude looks like he can be a legit corner. The Chiefs' key schedule stretch. You got Week 3 at the Ravens, which is going to be an awesome game. Can't wait for that one. Week 4, they're at home against the Pats. Week 5, they're at home against the Raiders. Then in Week 6, they go to the Bills. And then in Week 7, they go to the Broncos. So you got 2 division games in there. You got a game against the Ravens and the Patriots. So that is going to be a fun stretch for the defending Super Bowl champions. Next up, we got the Denver Broncos. They finished second in the West last year, 7-9 overall, 3-3 in the division. It was a frustrating year for the Broncos fans. It's now been 9 years with Elway as the director of player personnel, which is kind of crazy to think about. And it's been 4 seasons since the Super Bowl year with Peyton Manning. Yes, those seasons with Peyton were great, and the Super Bowl beatdown by the Seahawks was not so great, but they did win it 2 years later. But the Broncos quarterback situation has been awful since Peyton retired, and honestly, it wasn't really anything special before Peyton got there either. The year before Elway took over was the Tim Tebow year. He was drafted in the first round, and yes, I could easily insert a joke here, but Tebow is the only quarterback to start for Elway, not named Peyton Manning, that took them to the playoffs, albeit with an 8-8 record that year. So Elway inherits Tebow and Kyle Orton. Orton gets the start at the beginning of the season. He starts the first 5 games and goes 1-4. Then he gets waived by the Broncos. Tebow comes in, takes over, and it's Tebow mania, right? He goes 7-4 as the starter, gets the Broncos to 8-8, and he wins the wild card game, which they get to play at home. So they host the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tebow pulls out the victory with an 80-yard touchdown pass on a 5-yard slant to Demaryius Thomas. The next year, Elway signs Peyton Manning. He drafts Brock Osweiler. They trade away Tim Tebow. So a complete flip in the quarterback situation in 1 year. But the Manning signing works out great. You know, like I mentioned, they brought him to 2 Super Bowls. They won one of them. But the Osweiler draft pick was not very good. He did not turn out to be Peyton Manning's eventual replacement. Trevor Siemian, Paxton Lynch were both busts at quarterback after that. Free agent signings, Case Keenum and Joe Flacco were both also big flops. So last year, they started the season 2-6 under Joe Flacco. He averaged under 230 passing yards per game. He had 6 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, and he was sacked 26 times in the 8 games that he started. But they might have finally found themselves a quarterback here after all of that. Drew Lock, he started the last 5 games of 2019, 2 of them in the division. Denver won 4 of those 5 games, one of them being in a shootout in Houston, where Lock threw for over 300 yards. He had 3 touchdowns on only 27 pass attempts. He did throw 3 interceptions and only about 200 yards passing per game in those 5 games, but he showed some glimpses of being a legit starting quarterback in the NFL, and the Broncos sure as hell put a great group of playmakers around him this offseason. They spent big in free agency, signing guard Graham Gano to a 4-year deal, and they gave a 2-year, $8 million per year contract to Melvin Gordon, bringing the Broncos one of the best sets of linebackers in the league. They also signed Nick Vannett to add even more depth to that tight end group. I don't know what to make of the Gordon signing. The Broncos already had one of the better duos of running backs in the league with Philip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. Nick Fangio wants to run the ball and play defense, so I get wanting to have a deep stable of running backs. I guess having a starting quarterback on a rookie deal also helps, open the salary up a little bit to make an addition like this. All I know is I'm avoiding all these Bronco running backs. Maybe I'll get in on Royce Freeman if he lasts until the very end of a deep PPR draft, because I think he showed last year he's the better pass blocker than Lindsay, and I think he'll eventually see more targets. But for the most part, I'm going to avoid the Bronco running backs. I hate committees. Even though as a group, they should see a lot of work. Like I said, I can't stand starting a running back and not knowing whether I'm going to get five touches or 15 touches from the guy. But the biggest additions came through the draft, right? They drafted 3 wide receivers this year. First was Jerry Jeudy from Alabama. He'll take a lot of pressure off of Cortland Sutton. Judy's coach at Alabama, Nick Saban, said in an interview with SiriusXM that there's absolutely nothing wrong with him. He never missed practice, played in every single game, played in a Pro Bowl or a bowl game when he didn't have to. He's a great all-around receiver, great route runner, can really accelerate out of the break, Saban said. He compared him to Keenan McCardle, who played 15 seasons in the NFL and scored 63 touchdowns. Averaged just under 13 yards per reception, and in his 9 seasons with over 100 targets, he had over 1,000 yards in 5 of them, and over 890 yards in 3 of those other seasons. So a pretty good comparison, Keenan McCardle there to Jerry Jeudy, right from Nick Saban. In the second round, the Broncos got Drew Lock another weapon, KJ Hamler from Penn State. His best comp is probably Deshaun Jackson. Hamler is a speedster, a kick returner, and a super versatile wide receiver that can play in the slot and outside. With Sutton and Jeudy getting so much attention, Hamler should be able to use his speed to get over the top and hurt those defenses deep. Then in the third round, they took a center from LSU, Lloyd Cushenberry. He'll look to fill the center role left behind by Connor McGovern, signing with the Jets. In the fourth round, the Broncos took Drew Lock's teammate in college, tight end Albert Okbuanamu. He's 6'5", 260 pounds. He ran a 4.49 fastest among all the tight ends in this combine this year. He's a freak of an athlete, but this pick was a little surprising to me. They already had an athletic freak at tight end in Noah Fant, plus 5 other tight ends on the roster, including Jake Butt, who they drafted in the 5th round of 2017, and Troy Fumagalli, who they drafted in the 5th round of 2018. Plus, they got Jeff Hireman, who they signed last year in free agency, and now Nick Vannett, who they signed this year. So that is going to be a very crowded room, the tight end room for the Broncos. They've always been a team that leans heavily on their tight ends, especially in the running game. So Sutton and Okbuanamu will probably do the majority of the route running, and Noah Fant and Okbuanamu will probably do the majority of the route running, and the other guys will most likely do the majority of the blocking, but all these guys are going to eventually see a couple red zone targets each throughout the year. So for that reason, I'm probably going to also avoid the Bronco tight ends in fantasy this year. I think there's just too many guys taking away from Noah Fant, and I think the rookies' opportunities are not going to be big enough to be worthy of a roster spot. So I'm just going to avoid pretty much everybody on the Broncos except for maybe the QB and these wide receivers. The key schedule stretch for the Broncos: Week 10, they're at the Raiders. Week 11, they're at home against the Chargers. Week 12, they're they're at home against the Saints, and then Week 14, they're at the Chiefs. So that's going to be a pretty tough stretch for them. The beginning of the second half of the season. If they're a playoff team, we'll know by then, by the middle of that stretch right there. All right, next up, we got the Las Vegas Raiders, which still feels very strange to say. 7-9, they were 3-3 in the division. Year 2 of the rebuild under Mike Mayock and John Gruden, and we're starting to see this roster really take shape here. 2019 saw them go from 4 wins to 7 wins, and 3 of those losses were by 4 points or less. So they could have easily been a 500 team. We saw a bunch of picks from the 2019 draft make big contributions last year. Clennon Farrell and Max Crosby showed to be legit NFL defensive ends. Josh Jacobs led the team in rushing and had over 1,300 total yards in only 13 games. Hunter Renfrow proved to be a reliable slot receiver, especially in the last 2 games of the season. He had 209 yards, 2 touchdowns from 13 catches on 18 targets. Pretty good. Foster Moreau had 5 touchdowns, 1 behind Tyrell Williams for the team lead. And then Trayvon Mullen played in all 16 games, and Jonathan Abram, safety, was looking pretty good before he got hurt. So that 2018 draft looks like they did pretty well out there for the Raiders. Darren Waller was a standout player. He led the Raiders in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. He's had a pretty up-and-down career, only starting 3 games in his first 3 years in the league, which is including the year off that he had in 2017 when he served a full-year suspension, his second suspension for substance abuse. But he got clean last season, and he committed 100% to football, and he had a hell of a season. Perfect Raider story, right? Guy who was a cast-off from another team finds a home with the now Las Vegas Raiders. He was the darling at tight end last year, a guy a lot of people probably got with their last pick in the draft or someone that they added off of waivers, but he was huge in PPR. Wide receiver was a problem for the Raiders last year, saying it lightly. Coming out of Hard Knocks, they looked like they had one of the more well-rounded groups in the league. You know, you had Antonio Brown on one side, newly signed Tyrell Williams on the other side, with the rookie Hunter Renfrow in the slot. But we all know how things went with Antonio Brown. He never played a down for the Raiders. Then Tyrell Williams was forced into being the number one guy, and he started out really good, had 100 yards in week 1 and had a touchdown in each of his first 5 games. But then from week 9 on, he averaged only 43 yards and less than 3 catches a game, only caught 1 other touchdown that season. So finally, getting a wide receiver to replace Amari Cooper was crucial for the Raiders this offseason. They failed to do it last year. They had to do it this year. So they started that process by signing Nelson Aguilar from Philadelphia to a very team-friendly contract, 1 year, essentially $1 million. Then they bring in 2 tight ends, Jason Witten for his 18th year in the NFL, second year post-Monday Night Football, and Nick O'Leary. I'm guessing they signed O'Leary in case Foster Moreau isn't ready for week 1. He tore his ACL in week 14 or 15, I think it was. Continuing in free agency, the Raiders signed my man, DeMornay Pearsonell, standout wide receiver from the St. Louis Battlehawks of the XFL 2.0. He was a solid slot receiver, man. Caught 23 of 26 balls for 209 yards and 2 touchdowns I think they only played 5 games, maybe 6. He averaged 9.1 yards per catch. I'm excited for him. I hope he makes the team. He was a fun player to watch during those XFL games. But they, like the Broncos, went a little nuts in the draft and selected 3 wide receivers, starting with the first wide receiver taking in the draft, Henry Ruggs III from Alabama. Like the rest of us, the Raiders have been watching the Chiefs just completely dominate this division over the past few years with speed on offense. The Raiders have always been a team that values speed from the first days of the Raiders in the AFL Al Davis days. Once he said, we're going to stretch the field vertically. We ain't looking for first downs. We're looking for touchdowns. Al Davis would be very proud of this year's first-round pick. Ruggs ran a 4.27 40 at the Combine. He is exactly what Davis would have wanted. Then in the 3rd round, they take Lynn Bowden, who played receiver, running back, and quarterback throughout his time in Kentucky. He's as versatile as it gets. Last year, he had over 1,400 rushing yards, and he threw 3 touchdown passes. This year, this year he caught 67 balls for 770 yards and 5 touchdowns. Plus, he had over 1,600 return yards in his 3 years in college. That's a lot of return yards. So the Raiders are definitely getting a guy that will help them all over the field. They'll be able to pretty much do whatever they want with him. So he's going to be an exciting guy to watch. And then with the very next pick in the draft in the 3rd round, the Raiders got Brian Edwards from South Carolina. He is your typical NFL big body red zone threat. He's 6'3". A lot of scouts have him better suited in the slot, but with Renfrow, Aguilar, Bowden's probably going to work a lot in the slot, and all these tight ends, I think he's going to have to play outside, this being Brian Edwards. So if he can beat out Tyrell Williams for that number 2 spot, he could see plenty of significant playing time. The key schedule stretch for the Raiders, you got... They get what should be a pretty easy win in week 1 versus the Panthers. But then in week 2, they're at home against the Saints. Then they're at the Patriots. They're at home against the Bills. Then they're at the Chiefs. Then they come out of the bye versus the Buccaneers with Brady and the Browns, 2 tough games, then 3 straight division games after that. So the Raiders got it pretty tough this year. I wouldn't be surprised if you were looking at another 7-9, maybe 8-8 season from them. But it'll be their first year in their new home in Vegas, so that'll be exciting. And we'll have to see how this whole new group of wide receivers pans out there in Vegas. Last but not least, we got the LA Chargers. They were 5-11 last year, 0-6 in the division. The Phillip Rivers era with the Chargers ended with only 5 wins, and winless in the division kind of sucks. But the year started with some running back contract issues. Star runner Melvin Gordon holding out for a new contract. He ended up missing 4 games, in which coincidentally 2 of those 4 games he missed were 2 of the only 5 wins for the Chargers. So they went 500 in the 4 games without him. Thanks in big part to Austin Eckler. He was the number 2 running back in half PPR through the first 4 weeks of the season. He averaged just under 24 points per game in those 4 games without Gordon. He finished as the number 6 running back on the season. I've said it before on this podcast, but I'm going to say it again. Eckler is the forgotten running back of the 2017 class. That draft class included Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Kareem Hunt, James Conner, Tariq Cohen, Marlon Mack, Aaron Jones, and Chris Carson. Also, Matt Breida and Corey Clement were undrafted along with Eckler that year. So that's 11 starting running backs and 3 other major contributors. Pretty crazy how many running backs came out of that draft class. Then you got Keenan Allen. He started all 16 games last year. First time in his career he was able to do that. He also set his career high in receptions with 104. 2019 was his 3rd straight 1,000-plus yard season. Unfortunately, I don't think there will be another. I don't think there's going to be 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons. I'm just not sure how much this offense is really going to throw the ball, but we'll get into that a little bit. Mike Williams also had 1,000 yards receiving, his first in his short 3-year career. He also had his career high in yards per reception last year with 20.4. He was a deep threat guy for sure. He had the 8th most air yards in the league. He had the highest ADOT among all wide receivers with at least 50 catches. He was huge down the field, but his production in the red zone went down significantly. So in 2018, he caught 7 of 13 red zone targets for 6 touchdowns. In 2019, he only caught 3 of 15 red zone targets for 1 touchdown. So he had 2 more red zone targets, yet he caught 4 less balls and he had 5 less touchdowns. So he's got to show improvement in that department early on in the season, even in training camp, or else he's going to lose those super extremely valuable targets to guys like Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, and Hunter Henry. So Hunter Henry was a bit of a bust last year after missing 4 games with a leg tibial plateau fracture. He was drafted as the number 6 tight end, but according to Fantasy Pros 2019 ADP, and he finished as the number 9 tight end. So he was drafted as the 6th, finished as the 9, still finished as a top 12 tight end. But when you take a guy 6th, the 6th tight end off the board, you're kind of hoping for that guy to take the leap into that top 3 range, like we saw George Kittle do a few years ago, and like we saw Mark Andrews do last year. Henry has yet to play a full season in the NFL, going into his 5th season in 2020. His rookie year, he dealt with a concussion and a knee sprain earlier in the year that forced him to miss a few games. Then in 2017, he had a lacerated kidney late in the year, missed the last 2 games that season. And then 2018, during OTAs, he tore his ACL and missed the entire year. Despite all of that, he was franchise tagged this offseason and will make about $10.5 million this year and will be an unrestricted free agent in 2021. As I mentioned earlier, Phillip Rivers is out from Los Angeles and now in Indianapolis. He gave the Chargers 16 good years. He brought them to the playoffs 6 times, but he was never really able to get past the conference championship. But he's not the only guy to leave. We already mentioned Melvin Gordon leaving for the division rival Denver Broncos. Derek Watt and Travis Benjamin both spent the first 4 years of their careers with the Chargers, and Adrian Phillips was with the team for the first 6 years, but they all left for greener pastures. They signed Nick Vigil to fill Thomas Davis's spot, and they brought in Linval Joseph to shore up the D-line. But the biggest signing in free agency was getting cornerback Chris Harris from Denver. The four-time Pro Bowler who spent 9 years with the Broncos comes to L.A., and he joins an already pretty solid secondary. Casey Hayward and Desmond King have 3 Pro Bowls between the two of them. Darwin James looked like he could be the next big, strong safety. These guys make up one of the best secondaries in the league now with Chris Harris's ability to lock down receivers. And they're going to need it to cover all these guys that they're going to see this year in the AFC West. Kansas City's passing game still the biggest threat in football, and the Broncos and Raiders completely overhauling their wide receiver groups in the draft this year. The AFC West is going to be fun this year. But I want to take a minute real quick and look at Tyrod Taylor. He's going to be the starting quarterback, at least for the beginning of the season. Playing with a first rounder sitting behind him is nothing new to Tyrod, although I don't think there's going to be as much of an urgency to get Justin Herbert into the action this year as there was 2 years ago with Baker Mayfield in Cleveland. Tyrod had 3 years in Buffalo as the starter. He started in 14, 15, and 14 games in those 3 years. He averaged 200 yards passing and a little over 1 touchdown per game, but he had 36 yards rushing a game, and he had 14 rushing touchdowns in those 3 years. In 2016, he finished as the number 8 quarterback in fantasy. We're seeing it now with a lot of the industry rankers. Rushing ability is so big in projecting a quarterback's value. You look anywhere for rankings, you're going to see all the same names in the top 8 to 10. Obviously, Lamar Jackson because of what he can do with his legs, and yes, Patrick Mahomes, but then you get, Russell Wilson, Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Josh Allen. All these guys are going to get you points from their consistent rushing, and the threat of these dudes just ripping off a 40-yard touchdown run and getting you, 10 points in the snap of a finger, no matter what your scoring format is, that is legit. That brings you so much more value. So I think if you're someone that waits for quarterback, this is your year because you can easily get Tyrod Taylor and, say, Gardner Minshew or Sam Darnold with your last 2 picks. You could ride with Tyrod for the first few weeks of this and then stream from there. I think for a quarterback that runs as much as he does, he hasn't taken anywhere near the amount of punishment that some of these other guys have. So I really like Tyrod as the ultimate wait on quarterback strategy this year. The Chargers' key schedule stretch, they got a pretty easy schedule, actually. They finish with 3 straight division games at the Raiders versus the Broncos and at the Chiefs. But besides that, it's not a bad schedule for the Los Angeles Chargers. So that's going to do it for the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out next week as we tackle the first of the NFC divisions. I think we're going to start with the NFC East. So definitely check that out next week. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.
You know that feeling you get when you sense a team's winning streak is about to end? Or when you know the pundits are getting it all wrong? That feeling? That's me. I'm your hunch. I was there back in Istanbul when you just knew the comeback was on. I'm the guy that tells you when the odds don't look so odd. I'm your hunch. It's time to start listening.
Heed your hunch with Betway. Download the app to find out more about Betway's Bet Club. Full terms apply. 18 plus Dunlewy.net. Bet the responsible way.
You know that feeling you get when you sense a team's winning streak is about to end? Or when you know the pundits are getting it all wrong? That feeling? That's me. I'm your hunch. I was there back in Istanbul when you just knew the comeback was on. I'm the guy that tells you when the odds don't look so odd. I'm your hunch. It's time to start listening.
Heed your hunch with Betway. Download the app to find out more about Betway's Bet Club. Full terms apply. 18 plus Dunlewy.net. Bet the responsible way.